Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. I was blessed to know my grandparents, all four of them, two of whom were extraordinary. The paternal grandmother, my Grandma Greco, and maternal grandfather, Grandpa Morello, were wonderful, loving, special people who greatly influenced my life. I looked up to and loved and admired them all. My grandfather was known as Antonino Morello. He died when I was 11, but he was known to his wife, my grandmother Francesca, as Nino. To his 9 children, one of whom died in just infancy, he was known as Papa. And to his 30-plus grandchildren, he was known as Grandpa. He was born and raised in Palermo, where he worked in the fruit business, wholesale fruit marketing. And he met my grandmother, supposedly, at the Teatro Massimo, which is the Palermo Opera House, which is the second largest opera house in all of Europe. It's a magnificent place. I think only the Vienna Opera House is larger or grander than Teatro Massimo. And my grandmother was very fond of mentioning the fact that at every opportunity that she, when she met him, was in a reserved seat and he was in standing room. But that didn't interfere with their relationship because they got married. And at the turn of the century, they came to New York and ended up first in Manhattan and then in the suburbs of Brooklyn. The Brooklyn Bridge had recently been built and opened up Brooklyn to immigrants as sort of an affordable suburb. And Grandpa and Grandma ended up on Clinton Street in what is now known as Cobble Hill. In those days, it was Red Hook or South Brooklyn. It was a working-class neighborhood. But they rented a full brownstone home, and Grandpa never bought it. And he never bought it because he claimed he was only here temporarily and he was going to go back to Palermo where he was going to die happily and be buried. And actually that never happened. He ended up in Holy Cross Cemetery in Brooklyn. And it's funny, I always remember where his grave is. Right next to his grave, the next tombstone is inscribed, "Please stop and say a prayer. Today me, tomorrow you." And Grandpa's right next to that. And he was quite a character. All the neighbors in that part of Brooklyn worked in some way or shape or form connected to the Brooklyn docks, which are just a couple of blocks away. Grandpa, he didn't work at the Brooklyn docks. He worked in Manhattan for the United Fruit Company, where he was grading fruit for a wholesale market. And he was a guy of quiet dignity. He had friends who came from Sicily who respected him as a very decent man, kind-hearted, soft-spoken, but very strong character. He had a natural nobility about him. He stood ramrod straight, and he was known as a peacemaker. And he had friends around the neighborhood. I mean, that neighborhood was remarkable because it produced gangsters the way Kentucky produced racehorses or Western Pennsylvania would produce quarterbacks. Some of the more prominent names in that area that were his contemporaries and he had grown up with from Sicily and were Bonanno, Profaci, Colombo, Gallo, Gambino. You get the picture. My Aunt Gloria, his youngest child, once asked him, "Papa, how come all your friends are rich and some of them are very rich and they don't even go to work and you work all your life and you're not rich, we're not rich. How come?" And he said, "Well, Gloria, when somebody rings my doorbell at 3 o'clock in the morning, I answer the door." And he left it at that. And at holidays, the family would get together and we'd have a big gathering. Of course, he had, 8 children who survived and their children, his grandchildren. And the place would be packed. It would be chaotic. But when Grandpa entered the room, everybody would be quiet until Grandpa sat down. And again, my Aunt Gloria, the youngest, said to him, "Papa, come over here, sit here at the head of the table." And he looked at her and he said, "Gloria, wherever I sit is the head of the table." So he was unmoved by circumstance or any kinds of need for recognition. He was a very, very sweet guy. And again, as I said, he was a peacemaker. He would work every day, and as a little boy, I remember he would come home and go immediately around the corner to a storefront which served as the fraternal meeting house of a Sicilian society. And the men would be sitting around playing cards and drinking coffee or drinking anisette or a glass of wine. And they would play Italian card games, briscola or ziganet, the name of the games. And Grandpa would be there smoking his black Denobili or Parodi cigars known as Italian stinkers, those little crooked cigars. They were horrible, but all the men smoked them. And Grandma would send me to get him to fetch him for dinner and say dinner was ready. Now she wouldn't go there because if it was only around the corner, but if she went there, it would be an affront to his manhood. And you didn't want to do that. That was not done. So she was very clever. She used to send me, and I used to say, she said, go get Grandpa and tell him dinner's ready. And I would go there, and I would say, Grandpa, dinner is ready. Grandma wants you. And he would, in a show, wave me off, like, no big deal. That's okay. Sit down. And he told me to sit at a chair, and he would get me a coffee soda that I would drink, this Manhattan Special, I called it, a little Italian espresso soda. And I would sit there until he finished the cigar and a couple of rounds of, and then when he wanted to, he'd get up and he would say in Sicilian, Yamanin means andiamo, or let's go. And then we would go and we would go home and have dinner. So he used to tell me all the time about the fruit and the flowers in Palermo, and I thought he was exaggerating. He said, "Oh, the lemons are so big, the pears are so big, the oranges are so big, everything is, all the flowers are everywhere." And I thought, I said, I chalked it up to exaggeration. Except when I finally visited Sicily, I found out Grandpa was literally correct. This stuff was really big. It is really, really good. In Sicily, they have two seasons where they sell fruit and vegetables to the rest of Europe, all the European market. They have two big harvests, and they do very, very well. They're very prosperous over there. So he physically was slim and wiry. He was only about 5'8" or 5'9", but my aunts used to refer to him as tall. They said, he's like Abe Lincoln tall. He wasn't. But they thought he was tall because all the sisters, the five of them, were only 5'2" at most. And the three sons were only 5'6" at most. So Grandpa, being 5'8", was, loomed large in their imagination as a very tall guy. Well, he was always crazy about his grandchildren, and the favorite was always the youngest one, which was immediately replaced by the next one that came along. But Grandpa, every time he showed up, we thought he was Santa Claus because he had a Hershey bar for each kid whenever he showed up. And if he didn't have a Hershey bar, he'd have the nickel to buy the Hershey bar, and you'd get that. So all of us were always happy to see him. And I remember he was such a sweetheart of a guy. As a little kid, he used to cross his legs. He would sit in a chair, cross his legs, and then put me straddling his leg at the joint of the foot and the ankle. And he would take my hands and he would rock me back and forth like I was on a rocking horse, And he would get the biggest kick out of that, and so would all the little kids that he did that. He would come to our house twice a week. He was very fond of my mother, who was also a very, very good cook. And he would show up twice a week when I was little. And we had one of the first TVs on the block. And TV was an Admiral. It had a very tiny screen. And Grandpa and I would watch the Spacemen and the Cowboys and the wrestling, which he believed was real. and whenever the evildoers would get the upper hand, Grandpa was not above cursing at them in Italian while he was smoking his stinker cigar, But he really, really enjoyed this stuff. He was also politically aware because I remember sitting with him in Carroll Park with his friends, his contemporaries, and he would be critical or praising President Roosevelt, President Truman, Governor Dewey at the time, and he was very, very well informed and up on it. Anyway, he had a very simple, straightforward philosophy, which I never forgot, and it's followed me through my whole life. Grandpa's philosophy of life was, this is heaven and this is hell. How do you want to make it? It's up to you. And I've always lived by that, and it stood me in good stead. When Grandpa died, it was the end of an era. The family was never as close as it was when he was alive. And in my memory, I just think so fondly of him, and I say, long live the king. On the other hand, my paternal grandmother, Grandma Greco, she was tiny. She was maybe 5 feet tall on the best day of her life. And she died when I was about 34 years old. So I really, really knew her very, very well as well. And her name was Lorenza, her maiden name was Mangano. And she came from a little town just outside of Palermo called Carini, where she was the fourth of five sisters. And she had four older brothers. She was a tomboy, and she was known with all the kids in the neighborhood and her brothers as being a great tree climber, where she could go and poach oranges, pears, and lemons from the neighbors' trees. She tried to join the convent. She wanted to be a nun, and her mother took her to the convent, met with the mother superior, who asked about a dowry because nuns were considered brides of Christ, quote unquote, and therefore they had to bring a dowry to the convent to help sustain the convent financially. Well, her mother explained politely, my daughter doesn't have a dowry because I have three older daughters and there's only so much we have to spare. But her dowry is in her hands because her hands are golden. Everything she touches, whether she cooks, she sews, whatever she does with her hands, they're golden hands. And that's her dowry. She's very, very useful, very practical. And well, the mother superior said, that's nice, but that's not the dowry we're looking for. We don't need golden hands. So disappointed, Grandma Greco decided to get going with her brother Frank. Her oldest brother Frank had just been married, and he was heading for New York. This was also around 1902, 1903. He was heading for New York with his new bride, and my grandmother approached him and said, Frank, can I come with you? It'll be just another person that'll be able to work. I can help out, and it'll make things easier to get settled in New York if we can do it. No, Frank said fine, and so she went to her mother, and Grandma went along with it as long as she was going to live with Frank and his new bride. So she came to New York, and they ended up on 12th Street and Avenue A, which was an immigrant neighborhood, tenements, the Lower East Side, and mostly Italians, which were majority Sicilians, and the Eastern European Jews from Russia and Poland and thereabouts. So she went there, settled in, and got a job making dresses and decided that she was going to stay in New York because there was a future. There was always work. That was the big thing in Sicily. This is a beautiful place, but there's never been work enough for all the people. So she did make another trip back to Sicily to gather all her goods. It was, to come here and stay permanently and tell everybody that they should come if they wanted to. It's a good place to be. And when she got back, the first person, or one of the persons who heard about her trip back, was the mother superior of the convent, who then visited the house and said, okay, figuring Grandma must have come back with a golden paving stone from the streets of New York. We can let her in the convent now. And she said, no, thanks. No, I'm going to go back to New York and live my life in New York. So she came back, and now she started work again, making dresses, and she worked at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Most of the which was only blocks away from where she lived, and most of the girls in our neighborhood, the women and girls, worked there at Triangle Shirtwaist Company. She also met here a young dapper guy from Palermo, my grandfather, Eugenio Greco, who was a chauffeur, and he and she dated. He took her out on a date, and the story is, I don't know if it was the first date, the second date, but whenever it was, he kissed her goodnight. He just suddenly kissed her goodnight, caught her by surprise. And on the date after that, he said, well, we have to get married. She says, we have to get married? Why? He said, well, I kissed you on the last date, and now you're pregnant. You're going to have my baby, and you don't want to be a dishonorable person. You want to. So she married him, and she lived with him. They went on together, and on March 24th, 1911, she gave birth to my father, her first child. On Saturday, March 25th, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company burned down, and 168 of the women and girls who worked there died in that tragic fire, including many who jumped from the 8th floor. The doors were locked. They couldn't get in the hallways. They had to jump from the windows of the 8th floor to their deaths to escape being burned to death. It was a catalyst for the American labor movement and the start of the ILGWU, or the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, of which my grandmother became a charter member. And for 32 years, she worked for a company called Will Steinman and Company, who made custom dresses for the television show, the Arthur and Catherine Murray dance company. They were original first class gowns and dresses for that show. And she sat for 32 years at a sewing machine, surrounded by, on either side, by two of her friends who taught her how to speak Yiddish and how to speak Spanish. So she could speak Yiddish, Spanish, Sicilian dialect, standard Italian, and English better than I do. And all of this on a third grade education. She went to third grade. She was quite a gal. So she then moved with my grandfather to a beautiful house on Clinton Street in Brooklyn, a brownstone, a 4-story brownstone, which they bought. And she raised a family. She had 3 children, 2 sons, my father, his brother, and a daughter. And she raised them. And later on, the daughter became divorced and had a son who was mentally disabled to some extent. And she raised all of them. She would get up every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning. She'd go to bed at 7 o'clock at night and get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. The house was surgically cleaned, the whole 4 stories of the house. She would cook and leave everything on a low flame all day and come home, serve dinner, do whatever else she had to do, and then go to bed at 7 o'clock in the morning. She was a woman of great, great stature because she had to carry the burden of taking care of her husband, her daughter, who was not well herself. She was a sickly daughter, and her grandson, the daughter's son, and go to work and take care of her elderly mother, all of which she did with a smile. She never did anything but smile, never complained. She never took a vacation. She just worked and worked and worked and smiled and smiled and smiled. And she was quite a character. She was a woman of a very simple taste. And she always had a little pocketbook with her and a small watch that she wore on her wrist. It looked like a masculine watch. It was a small silver watch. And in the pocketbook, she would always have hard coffee candy that was her only indulgence. And she would give one to me every time she saw me. And she would sometimes walk to the subway to Manhattan for her job, which was about 1.5 miles away, downtown Brooklyn. And in good weather, she would walk to save the nickel fare so she wouldn't have to spend it. And she was tough in her own way. She was very soft and sweet, but she was tough. That neighborhood, we had rats in that neighborhood because of the proximity to the docks, which is just the Brooklyn docks were just a couple of blocks away. And they had coal-fired heating, and Grandma would shovel coal, and the rats would come in. There was a little opening in the basement of every building where the coal chute was, where the coal deliveries would come, and they would slide the coal down the chute into the basement. And Grandma would shovel coal. She would shovel ashes. And if she found a rat, I saw her do this once, personally myself. She clobbered the rat with her broom, took him out by the tail, and dumped him in the garbage like nothing happened, no problem. And she would go on. At the stores, she was a tiny terror because, God forbid, any shopkeeper who tried to skimp or slight the weight or the quality of whatever she was buying. In her favorite store, she would let them have it. And her favorite store was Goldman's Maria, which was a salt store which they sold preserved meats and dairy. And Goldman, Mr. and Mrs. Goldman, their son, Sal, hooked up with his neighborhood friend Alex, and they formed Goldman DiLorenzo. Goldman DiLorenzo, the Goldman started in a push cart. There were push carts in the neighborhood, just like the Lower East Side. And Goldman DiLorenzo became some of the biggest property holders in Manhattan. And they owned, at one point, the Chrysler Building, among others, and other big ones. They were very, very successful. And also the neighborhood right there, the pushcart community, produced Eli Wallach, the famous actor. He was also from the neighborhood there. And Grandma would, in her later years, would go shopping. And she was tiny, and she would carry 2 shopping bags, one on either side. And occasionally, the notorious Gallo brothers would see her and offer to carry her packages. Mrs. Greco, come on, we'll take the packages. No, fellas, I'm okay. When I need help, I'll let you know, okay? Thank you very much. And she would be on her way, and she would leave them there staring at her, so she was in her 90s. So I went to see her, and she was visibly perturbed in this one particular occasion. And I said, Grandma, what's wrong? Oh, nothing, Rudy. She wouldn't complain about anything. I said, no, Grandma, what do you mean? Come on, what's wrong? She said, well, okay. She said, I had 2 teenagers sitting on the stoop, and they were shouting and making noise, and I'm trying to read. And my window is right near the stoop, and I got annoyed and I went out there and I said, "Excuse me, fellas, it's okay. You can sit on my stoop, but please be quiet so I can read and, in peace. Okay? Okay." She says, "I went inside. 2 minutes later, same old, same old. They're doing the same thing and they're yelling and shouting and everything else." So I went outside and I said to them, "Listen, boys, I was nice the first time. Now I'm going to tell you, you don't keep quiet, I'll break your legs, both of you." I said, "Grandma, are you kidding?" "No," she said. I said, "Well, what happened? Why didn't?" She said, "No, they got scared. They ran away." I said, "Okay." She was something else. Cool as a cucumber. Grandma invited me to sit down and watch her favorite TV show if I had time. I said, "Of course I have time. I'll sit down." I said, "What's the show?" She said, "Don't worry, you're going to love the show. You know it. It's a great show, the best show on television." Next thing I know, she turns on the TV, and almost immediately, and I hear a theme song. Dun 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 dun. Of course, it's Bonanza. I said, "Grandma, this is your favorite show?" She says, "Yes, it's the best show on television. Don't you understand?" I said, "I know. What makes it so good?" She said, "Come on. The father, he raised 3 boys. The mother died, and he's raising the boys by himself. And he did a beautiful job with his sons. They all get along and respect the father. Sometimes, they disagree, but they all respect one another. Horse, he's the big, strong brother. He listens to his older brother. The little brother, sometimes he disagrees and he does things wrong, but they always protect him. Anybody comes around a stranger with trouble, and they all stick together no matter what. That's a fantastic family. That's the kind of family you want. And that's why it's my favorite show." I said, "Okay, Grandma, I understand. Who knew the Cartwrights were Sicilians?" When she retired, by the way, from the ILGWU after so many years, a 32 years member, she got her gold watch from Norman Thomas, the 6-time socialist candidate for president of the United States. He came personally to give her the watch. She was a character. She used to take me she was such a simple person. She had such simple taste. Her big treat, she would take me and we would go on a round trip up Court Street and back down, or up Smith Street and back down on Court Street to downtown Brooklyn on the trolley or the bus. And she would be delighted just sitting there with me looking out at the bus ride was entertainment for her. That was a big, big treat. She was such a sweetheart of a person. And again, never complaining about anything. And I remember once tearing my tweed jacket. I tore it on a nail or something. And I gave it to her and she weaved it back together, and you could never see where it was torn. It was invisible. She was very, very, again, golden hands, I guess. Well, eventually she passed on. She was 96. And the best eulogy I think I've ever heard was given by a neighbor, a woman, Mrs. Marticello, whose husband, Henry Marticello, was a very, very highly respected appellate division justice in New York State. And Mrs. Marticello said of my grandmother, when Mrs. Greco died, she went to heaven so fast they didn't have time, the angels, to put the wings on her. And when I think back about my 2 grandparents, those particular grandparents, I think back with all my memories, and one thought comes to mind. All kings don't live in castles, and all queens don't wear a crown. And that comes to mind whenever I recall Grandpa Morello and Grandma Greco. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.